You know how many disabled people are contacting me at the moment saying, I don't know what to do, I want to end my life. Do I just fall into poverty, or am I such a burden on society and on my family that I choose this option to end my life? A lot of disabled people are calling this modern day eugenics.
This week, we're talking about the backlash to Labour's highly controversial welfare reforms. We're also going to look at Trump and Putin carving up Ukraine and Kemi Badenoch's decision to ditch net zero. I'm Lizzy Buchan.
I'm Christian Calgie.
And this is The Division Bell.
So the big story this week has been international. It's been Ukraine yet again. Last night, Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky had a phone call. Thankfully, it went a lot better than the meeting in the White House. Do you want to fill us in on what went down during that?
Yeah, so they much more sort of warm conversation than the last time they spoke. It sounds, from some of the readouts that came out overnight, it sounds like they talked about what to do about Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So one of the proposals on the table at the moment has been for the US and Ukraine proposal put to Russia was for a sort of a ceasefire around energy, because Russia keeps absolutely hammering Ukraine's energy plants, nuclear power, taking control of a nuclear power station, that sort of thing. Putin sort of agreed to it and then immediately just carried on with his barrage of strikes. So it sounds like Trump and Zelensky talked about possibly the US almost taking control of some of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which Zelensky's team later said they were mainly talking about a specific plant, Zaporizhzhia, which is under Russian control.
With basically, I think at the moment, the West is sort of praying that Putin refuses the ceasefire deal, because that might force Trump to come off the fence a bit and actually start siding with Ukraine.
And in other massive news this week, I've definitely been all over this story. Kemi Badenoch has had her sort of cut the green crap moment.
Yeah.
You want to tell us a bit about that?
You're right to say it's massive, because this debate really cuts to the heart of whether Britain is responsible for 1% of global emissions or 0% of global emissions. You know, obviously that is the difference between life and death. But this is quite a big moment for net zero in this country, because up until now, despite everything, you have had a broad coalition between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and indeed the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. It's only been Reform that have opposed net zero. Now the Conservative Party have come out against net zero, with Kemi Badenoch calling it impossible to achieve and warning that trying to achieve it would bankrupt the country. And I think she made a lot of very sensible points. But you do now have, it has really politicised net zero in a way that it wasn't before between right and left. The public are broadly supportive of net zero, right? And the British public essentially are in favour of hugging huskies and stroking polar bears and all the rest of it.
I mean, that's not entirely what net zero is.
Basically, yeah. It'll keep them around for a bit longer.
And, stop warming of the planet.
But only if America and China and India get on board.
Sure.
Britain is, we're
but that doesn't mean we don't have a responsibility here. And this is another. Well,
not to you, obviously. No one's
outrageous.
No one's listening to this. Is a global leadership.
No, of
nonsense.
course.
There's not. China are building multiple coal power fire factories and all the rest of it, and we're crippling ourselves to make a drop in the ocean. I think she's right. But the point I was going to make is that the British public are broadly supportive, so they want politicians to go along with it. But at some point, and Rishi identified this as well, Rishi Sunak, when he delayed certain targets for electric cars and heat pumps and all the rest of it.
And was richly rewarded at the polls by losing them. But absolutely appalling victory.
No one voted Labour for net zero.
Is this not just an example of Kemi just cravenly chasing the Reform vote? And sort of Reform and the Tories are just dancing in this sort of right at the edge of what the public are interested in. Because this is not what the public are calling for. The public are talking endlessly about the cost of living crisis, and I accept that there is a net zero element to that, but they're talking about the cost of living crisis, public services, they're worried about global conflict, and then Kemi's like, oh, let's talk about net zero. I didn't even go to that speech. Who cares?
Admittedly, I didn't watch it. She then had another speech in King's Cross where she was not announcing policy, she was announcing the intention to announce policy at some point. She started these policy commissions, which came on the same day, in the same morning as Liz Kendall announced all the welfare stuff. I mean, it's almost like CCHQ's just sacked half its press officers. Let's talk about welfare cuts, which I think is very interesting, especially given the Mirror has become well, I don't know if you're a critical friend on this issue. You're just critical. Liz Kendall has announced £5 billion in savings, as the government would call it, largely through changing eligibility to PIP. Now, this is to address the country. I mean, it is an incredibly unaffordable bill. The total bill is set to rise from £48 billion on health-related benefits to £76 billion by 2030. Clearly, that's insane, and it's growing almost exponentially and has been since COVID. And it's had a lot of interesting fallout, not least civil war yet again in the Labour Party.
This is the worst I've ever seen it in Labour under Keir Starmer's leadership. The level of unhappiness is quite palpable. And there have been a lot of meetings recently. The government were getting MPs into Downing Street to try and brief them on the plans, to try and sell them a bit. Lots of unhappiness. The fact that the vast majority of the savings are being taken from PIP, personal independence payment, which is not an out-of-work benefit, has really caused a lot of unhappiness.
Which is just, I mean, from my perspective, is insane. Because as I said, I mean, the current benefits bill of £48 billion is almost incomprehensible. The fact it's going to rise to £76 billion, you put it in those terms, the fact Labour is getting so angry over a meagre £5 billion, and the Tories are calling it a squandered opportunity, because in the grand scheme of things, £5 billion is absolutely nothing.
But £5 billion
I find that level of opposition to something that's actually quite conservative is a bit hysterical and unnecessary.
But £5 billion is not very much in the scheme of government spending, but it's an enormous, life-changing thing for a lot of actual people. You know, MPs of all sides are getting their constituents coming to them saying, I don't know what's going to happen to me. That's really hard.
Well,
Tories are getting it. Lib Dems are getting it. You know, there are all. It's not. That's not party. Like that doesn't depend on the party.
There's always going to be that level of apprehension amongst people who are rightfully entitled to this. But I think the main problem is and Liz Kendall is right to talk about this, is the eligibility point. I think many people would argue and observe that there are clearly people claiming benefits who do not need to receive benefits. Why anyone should get any form of welfare for example, anxiety or ADHD is ridiculous.
It's not ridiculous to suggest that people might need support with anxiety. Sometimes it can be totally debilitating.
Labour is right to identify that the system needs reform. I just don't think that what's been outlined yet is radical enough. But clearly, as you've identified, the backlash has already been so great over a mere £5 billion. I think it's going to be very difficult when Liz Kendall or whoever is welfare secretary in a couple of years' time has to inevitably come back, as I think they almost certainly will, with more. Because at the moment it doesn't go far enough.
I mean, there is a question about it's a lot of political pain to take for something
gain.
that is not going to fix the whole system by any stretch.
No.
We've been talking about the politics of welfare, but we wanted to get a perspective from, about the real life impacts of these decisions. So a little earlier, I spoke to Dr Shani Dhanda, who's an accessibility and inclusion consultant and broadcaster. She was born with brittle bone disease and also has short stature. And she talked to us a little bit about why disabled people need support to get into the workforce and how these reforms might affect them. The government has set out this week the first sort of details of a massive overhaul to the welfare system, which includes huge changes to personal independence payments and other kind of health and disability benefits. It's been quite a backlash to it. What's your impression then of what you've seen so far?
These cuts are very cruel. They're only going to put more disabled people into poverty, when actually half of everyone that already lives in poverty is either a disabled person or they're a carer of a disabled person. Cutting vital support for disabled people that we need does not magically create jobs. None of this makes sense.
One of the things that they've talked about is how this is an attempt to get people back into work. And I think one of the things that you see is it's presented as a sort of, people are just on benefits, but they need to get back into work. But that's actually not what PIP or some of these other benefits are for. PIP is for people who are not, it's not an out of work benefit. So do you think that positioning is unfair to disabled people?
Absolutely. And it only reinforces the government's view of disabled people as calling us scroungers, benefit cheats, work shy. We had that in the last government. It seems like this government are carrying on that narrative that doesn't help disabled people in any way. It makes there be more bias in society towards hiring disabled people. And that was my story when I first tried to enter the workforce at 16. I had to remove any mention of my disability. And it wasn't until I did that that I got offered an interview. And that was after applying for over 100 jobs. 100 entry-level jobs that didn't need any experience and you didn't need any qualification. But at 16, I could work, I wanted to work, and I wanted to contribute to society. And I wasn't the barrier. It was the bias that people had against employing disabled people. And I wish I could sit here and say to you, but it's changed now. But it hasn't. That happened to me when I was 16. I'm now 37, and disabled people are still twice as likely to be unemployed. We have to apply for 60% more jobs, and 1 in 5 employers said that they would not hire a disabled person. And if I'm being totally honest, this is only going to cost them so much more money in the long run. They're going to push more disabled people into poverty. That's going to be a higher expense to the taxpayer because of increased healthcare costs, because of increased social care costs. That's, by the way, if people can access any of this. PIP, as you said, is not an unemployment benefit. PIP is a benefit that exists because the government recognise that it costs a lot more for disabled people to live. And on average, that cost is an extra £1,000 a month more. I work in London, but I can't use the tube. And that's because the majority of the tube stations have steps, and they are not step free. They don't all have a lift, and they don't all have escalators. So my only option to get around the city is by taxi. And that is the most expensive option. And I know other people might think, well, I have to pay out of my pay packet to get to work. But they have other options. They have options to use cheaper options like public transport. The option just isn't available for disabled people.
And there's so many sort of barriers to disabled people, just as you say, getting to work, getting around. In the workplace, what kind of support obviously it's going to differ for every person, but what kinds of support do people need?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked me this, because there seems to be a massive misconception that people think it's really expensive to hire disabled people. It isn't. And there's this horrible bias and stereotype that disabled people are less productive than non-disabled people. Again, not true. So we know that research tells us that the average cost of a workplace adjustment, so an example of a workplace adjustment could be For me, I needed a bespoke chair because I have a short stature. I needed a footstool because I don't want my legs to be dangling all day. I needed a smaller keyboard because I'm just a smaller person and these things help me. The average cost of a workplace adjustment is £75.
Yeah, it's not a lot of money for,
I'm seeing a lot of, especially small business owners saying, well, I need to be compensated because who's going to compensate for the loss of productivity? Hello, we as disabled people live in a world that isn't designed for us. We have to problem solve the most basic and most complex of challenges in every part of our life. I'm the height of a 4-year-old. There are more clothes designed for dogs than disabled people. I have to figure out how I'm going to make clothes work for me because there's no retailer that makes clothes for my body. And no, I cannot wear kids' clothes. Do you understand? Like figuring out how to reach my kitchen cupboards is the least of my problems. We have to get society to understand hiring a disabled person, it means that you're tapping into a pool of untapped talent, resource, a diverse perspective that do want to work, that want to be in the workplace, and employers and businesses that are already doing it are already reaping the rewards, because the more diverse your workplace is, it's over 30% more likely you are to be more productive and more profitable. I'm on the government's website. It's findajob.dwp.gov.uk. And there are only 137 fully remote jobs available with disability confident employers. And then if I click to look for part-time jobs that are fully remote, it goes down to 8. The issue here isn't that disabled people don't want to work. The issue is there aren't jobs for them to go into, and there aren't employers that will give disabled people the time of day. So I used to work with Virgin Media, and we had a 3-year charity partnership with Scope. They're a planned disability charity. And over 3 years, we helped over 1 million disabled people get employment support advice to get into work. No one can tell me disabled people don't want to work. And if the government did close the disability employment gap, they would have £50 billion more annually in their public purse. I am someone that welcomes reform, but in the right way, and that doesn't demonise disabled people, and that doesn't push us more into poverty, because the only way to get out of poverty, if you think about it, is by working, is by increasing how much money you can earn. So it's this vicious cycle. The government's pushing you into poverty. No one's giving you a job opportunity, and it goes round and round. And we've got to talk about, this is against the backdrop of the assisted dying bill. Do you know how many disabled people are contacting me at the moment saying, I don't know what to do, I want to end my life? Already they're saying that because they've already lived in so much uncertainty and so much hardship already that so many disabled people are already in poverty and destitution, and they can't see any way out because the opportunities aren't there. And I want to make another point here that the consultation came out on the 18th of March. The government are saying, tell us your views, but there are no accessible formats. And the government said, we haven't had the time to make it accessible for you. So anything that the government are saying that might be positive, it's undermined by everything that they're doing. And it's undermined because they can't even be bothered to put it out in an accessible format.
You mentioned before about assisted dying. Did you mean that people are so frightened by what is happening with the welfare reforms that they're getting in touch with you about that? That's shocking.
And I too have felt that massive sense of hopelessness, especially at a young age. When I was trying to get into work and I couldn't get into work, it left me feeling hopeless for my future. And, I had my whole life ahead of me at that point. And if I didn't make the decisions then to create my own opportunities, I don't know what I'd be doing now. And that is really scary. So the reality for people will be, do I just fall into poverty, or am I such a burden on society and on my family that I choose this option to end my life? A lot of disabled people are calling this modern day eugenics. 83% of disabled people acquired their health condition during their working life. So what that means is 83% of disabled people today were not born with a health condition or an impairment. So what that means is if you're not disabled yet, you will be one day. And it shouldn't take for that day to come for you to care about disability, inclusion and accessibility, because accessibility benefits everybody.
Do you think that the government should be looking at a different strategy instead? Because there have been calls for things like a wealth tax from a number of quarters, to try. They've positioned this reform alongside their attempts to kind of stabilise the country's finances. But there are always other strategies. And I think Diane Abbott, the Labour MP yesterday, was saying in Parliament, the government shouldn't be balancing its books on the backs of the most vulnerable.
There are many ways to cut this, but the way in which the government are choosing to talk about this is one that is demonizing. It's gonna ruin people's mental health even more. It's gonna shatter anybody's confidence to try and get into the workplace against this narrative. And sadly, it continues that disgusting rhetoric that disabled people are either work shy or lazy. And I just want to add one thing here. It was back, I think, in 2017 when Philip Hammond was our Chancellor. I don't know if anybody remembers, but he blamed the whole of the UK's low productivity on there being more disabled people in work. I don't know if anybody remembers that. So, as a disabled person, and especially as a disabled person in work or trying to get in work, we'll never win. We'll never be doing the right thing. Because if we are in work, we're blamed for the whole country's low productivity. And if we're not in work, we're not doing enough to get into work. But really, the opportunities aren't there.
So some people see benefits as a perk. What would you say to that?
I'm really aware that this is the case. Like, I'm someone, I've had my blue badge stolen many times out of my car. And that's when I realized that, people actually don't realize this helps me live my life. And without this, I wouldn't be able to. And they see it as a perk because they don't have those barriers. They don't understand the challenges that we face. Therefore, they just see it as, it's free money, or, it's closer parking. I want that too. But what people don't realize is without that, we wouldn't be able to do the things that we are able to do. Mm-hmm. So disabled people need these things to live our lives, the basic things that we can do in our life. If people don't get PIPs, some people will not be able to work because they need help with washing and dressing, because they perhaps don't have an accessible kitchen or an accessible home, so they won't be able to feed themselves, prepare food or wash their clothes. Do people not realize that without, basic access, people will never be able to get in work? If this really is a conversation about getting people into work, there are certain things that we have to all be able to do to be functional, to be presentable, to be clean, to have our healthcare needs met, our medical needs met. This is not about perks. And the fact that it is being reduced to that goes to show how little representation we have of disabled people. Because if you think about it, the only time we see disabled people on TV is if we're talking about disability, largely about disability benefits, or if you're seeing us in the Paralympics. These two extremes of representation are very dangerous. And again, the media is to blame for this. Why don't we see disabled CEOs? Why don't we see disabled people just going about doing what they do? Or why don't we see disabled people and their struggle to get into work? Because that is very real.
And if you could give a message directly, if you could speak to Keir Starmer, what would you say to him?
Firstly, I'd like to say that you've got this all wrong. And, a lot of people are telling me that Keir had a disabled brother. And I'm really shocked that you will have had some lived experience of knowing and having a loved one with a disability, and yet this is still the path that you've chosen. And don't make these decisions for your own gain and your policy, your party's own gain, on the backs of disabled people, on the backs of the most vulnerable people in society. And actually, if you work with us, if you really understand what we need and let us help you do that, and I'm someone, I would love to help you do that, Keir Starmer, you will have much better outcomes. You don't have to do this to try and score points and not lose votes in the next election to other parties. Don't do that at the expense of disabled people. History will never let you forget that. And I'm sure you wouldn't want your legacy to be that.
That was another episode of The Division Bell. Thank you so much for joining us. As ever, please do like and subscribe, and also follow our socials at Mirror Politics and at Daily_Express. We very much hope you join us next time for another episode of The Division Bell.